It's December 18th, 1944. Snow falls thick over the forests of Belgium, muffling the sounds of war. Inside a captured American command post near Bühlingen, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the Wehrmacht's 277th Volksgrenadier Division stands over a prize his men have just seized. An M7 Priest, 105mm self-propelled Howitzer motor carriage. Still warm, still reeking of cordite. Weber circles the vehicle slowly, his breath clouding in the frozen air. He's seen plenty of American equipment in the last 72 hours since the Ardennes offensive began. Jeeps, half-tracks, Shermans. But this is different. This isn't just a tank with a bigger gun. This is artillery. Mobile artillery. Artillery that can keep pace with advancing armor, that can fire and displace in minutes, that doesn't need horses or prime movers or an hour of setup time. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Weber's own artillery batteries are miles behind him, struggling through the snow with their 15-centimeter Schwerfeldhaubitze 18 howitzers. Each one weighs over 6,000 kilograms. Each one requires a team of horses or a half-track to tow it. Each one takes 20 minutes to unlimber and set up for firing. And in this offensive, in these forests, with American resistance stiffening by the hour, 20 minutes might as well be 20 years. But this American machine, Weber climbs onto the hull, peers into the open fighting compartment. 69 shells stored inside. The gun can traverse 45 degrees, maximum elevation of 35 degrees. The whole vehicle sits on a Sherman tank chassis. Continental radial engine. Same reliable drivetrain that powers the most produced armored vehicle in the American arsenal. He doesn't need a manual to understand what he's looking at. This is what the Truppenführung, Germany's basic warfighting doctrine, had always called for. Artillery with great mobility to achieve its full effect. Except the Americans had actually built it. The Americans had actually fielded it. And the Americans had fielded thousands of them. To understand how this single captured vehicle represented everything that had gone wrong with German artillery doctrine, we need to go back not to the Ardennes, but to the drawing boards and proving grounds where both nations approached the same problem with radically different solutions. In 1941, both Germany and America faced the same challenge. Modern armored warfare demanded artillery that could keep pace with tanks. The Blitzkrieg concept required combined arms. Tanks without artillery support were vulnerable. Artillery that couldn't keep up with tanks was useless. But how to solve this problem revealed two entirely different philosophies of warfare. Germany's answer was elegant, but limited. They developed self-propelled guns, the Wespe, the Hummel. These were essentially tank chassis with howitzers mounted on open-topped superstructures. The 105mm Wespe, based on the Panzer II chassis, could fire on the move. The 150mm Hummel, using a hybrid Panzer III and IV chassis, provided heavier firepower. Both were technically sophisticated. Both were effective when available. But Germany never produced enough of them. By 1944, the Wehrmacht had manufactured only around 680 Wespes, maybe 700 Hummels, and most German divisions still relied on the SFH-18, a superb howitzer. Accurate, hard-hitting, but fundamentally a towed gun designed in the 1920s, dependent on horses or trucks for movement. The German doctrine had evolved from necessity. After the Treaty of Versailles banned Germany from developing certain weapons, they'd secretly designed the SFH-18 between 1926 and 1930. It was twice as heavy as its predecessor, with a range of over 13 kilometers. Split trail carriage. Excellent traverse. But it was still a towed weapon, and in 1944, much of the Wehrmacht's artillery was still pulled by horses. America took a different path. When USA, army observers watched the German campaigns in Poland and France, they reached a stark conclusion. They needed self-propelled artillery with sufficient firepower to support armored operations. Not just a few, not just for elite units, for every armored division. In August 1941, Major General Jacob Devers became chief of the armoured force. An artilleryman himself, Devers wanted artillery that could provide close fire support to the leading elements of his armoured divisions, not artillery that followed behind, not artillery that needed an hour to set up, artillery that could roll forward with the tanks, stop, fire, and move again in minutes. On October 1st, 1941, Devers recommended building 2 prototypes using the M3 tank chassis. The designation was T-32, mount an M2 A1 105mm howitzer in an open-topped superstructure, add a machine gun for self-defense. The Baldwin Locomotive Works completed both prototypes in about a month. They went to Aberdeen Proving Ground for testing in February 1942. Within 4 days, they were approved for modification and production. The modifications came fast. Increase the frontal armour height for better crew protection. Lower the side armour to make it easier to access the fighting compartment. Increase the howitzer traverse to 45 degrees. And most critically, make sure the whole system was reliable enough for mass production. By April 1942, the M7 was rolling off the assembly line, 3 months from prototype to production. That was the American way. The British were the first to use it in combat. 90 M7s reached the British 8th Army in North Africa in October 1942, just in time for the Second Battle of El Alamein. The British called it the Priest because the pulpit-like machine gun mount reminded them of a church pulpit. And it worked. The M7 could follow the advancing armour, provide fire support on demand, and relocate quickly when German counter-battery fire came in. The British requested 5,500 more. They never got that many, but the request itself spoke volumes. This wasn't just another weapon system. This was a fundamental shift in how artillery supported maneuver warfare. For American forces, the M7 became standard. Each armoured division reorganised in March 1942, with 3 armoured field artillery battalions containing 54 M7s, 18 howitzers per battalion, 6 per firing battery. These weren't held in reserve for special occasions. They were integral to every armoured operation. They trained with the tanks. They moved with the tanks. They fought with the tanks. The tactical employment reflected the new reality. M7 batteries were routinely assigned to the leading elements. They'd fire preparation barrages before attacks, then follow through with the assault and provide close support as needed. The gun crews could displace and be ready to fire again in under 5 minutes. For German artillerymen watching through field glasses, it must have seemed like sorcery. American artillery that appeared, fired, vanished, and appeared somewhere else. The logistics told another story. The M7 carried its own ammunition, 69 rounds in the later models. It carried its crew of 7 in armour protection. It could travel at 26 miles per hour on roads, 15 miles per hour cross-country. Its range was over 125 miles on internal fuel. You didn't need a supply column of horse-drawn wagons following it. You didn't need separate prime movers. Everything was integrated into one tracked chassis. American industrial capacity made the difference. By the time the war ended, the United States had produced over 4,300 M7s, 3,489 of the original M7 based on M3 chassis, 826 M7B1s based on the M4 Sherman chassis. They served in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the breakout from France, and now, in December 1944, in the snow-choked forests of Belgium, they were providing the mobile fire support that American doctrine had envisioned back in 1941. Germany's situation was starkly different. While the Wehrmacht had theoretically called for mobile artillery since the 1930s, practical reality had never caught up with doctrine. The SFH-18 remained the backbone of German divisional artillery, and despite being an excellent weapon, it was bound by the limitations of towed artillery. Set-up time, displacement time, vulnerability during both, and most damaging of all, dependence on horse teams. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was using approximately 50,000 horses for transport in the Ardennes offensive alone. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Germany's fuel situation was desperate. Synthetic fuel plants had been bombed. Romanian oil fields were in Soviet hands. Every litre of gasoline was precious, rationed carefully to the panzers and the most essential vehicles. Horse-drawn artillery wasn't a tactical choice. It was a logistical necessity born from industrial exhaustion. And horses are slow. A horse team pulling an SFH-18 could manage perhaps 15 kilometers per day in good conditions. Less in snow, less on bad roads, much less under air attack. The forward units of a German armoured division could be 10 or 20 kilometers ahead of their supporting artillery. And that gap, that fatal gap between the panzers and the guns, left German armour vulnerable to exactly the kind of concentrated American artillery fire that the M7 made possible. The Ardennes offensive had exposed this weakness with brutal clarity. Hitler had assembled one of the largest remaining concentrations of German armour for the attack, over 1,400 tanks and assault guns, 2,600 artillery pieces, but many of those artillery pieces were towed guns, pulled by horses, struggling through narrow forest roads clogged with traffic. The plan had depended on speed, break through the American lines, capture fuel depots, race to the Meuse River and then to Antwerp, cut off the Allied armies in the north, force a negotiated peace. But speed required everything moving together: panzers, infantry, artillery. And the artillery couldn't keep up. Meanwhile, American artillery dominated. Each U.S. armoured division had 3 battalions of M7s. Each infantry division had towed artillery, but even that was fully motorized, pulled by trucks, not horses. And American artillery doctrine had refined fire direction to a science: forward observers with the leading elements, radio communication back to battalion fire direction centers, massed fires on call. American artillery could concentrate the fires of multiple battalions on a single target within minutes. German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein would later comment on the effectiveness of American trucks in increasing the mobility of artillery units, even Soviet ones. The Americans had sent thousands of vehicles to the Red Army through Lend-Lease. Those trucks transformed Soviet artillery from slow-moving horse-drawn batteries into mobile fire brigades, the same transformation that American M7s had brought to US armoured divisions. Hauptmann Weber stood in that captured command post, looking at that M7 priest, and he understood. This wasn't just a vehicle. This was the physical manifestation of American industrial supremacy, not superior German engineering outmatched by quantity, but American engineering that was good enough, produced in overwhelming quantity, and integrated into a doctrine that actually used it effectively. The M7 wasn't the best howitzer in the world. Its maximum elevation of 35 degrees limited its range compared to a properly emplaced towed gun. Its armour was relatively thin, 12 to 62 millimeters at most. A panther could punch through it easily. But that wasn't the point. The point was that it could keep up with the Shermans. The point was that it could displace under fire. The point was that there were thousands of them, and they were where they needed to be, when they needed to be there. Weber had heard the stories from the Eastern Front, German units outranged by Soviet artillery. The SFH-18, excellent as it was, couldn't match some Russian guns for sheer distance. The Germans had tried to fix it, modified versions with longer barrels, rocket-assisted projectiles, but those solutions introduced their own problems: reduced accuracy, increased wear on the barrel, and none of it solved the fundamental issue. Towed artillery was inherently slower than self-propelled artillery. The Americans had started with that premise and built their entire system around it, every element optimized for mobile warfare. The M7 chassis used components from the most produced tank in American history. Parts were interchangeable. Maintenance was straightforward. Crews trained on the vehicle until they could service it blind. Folded. Training manuals were standardized. Doctrine was refined through actual combat experience and disseminated throughout the force. German self-propelled artillery, when it existed, was excellent. The Hummel was a devastating weapon system, but Germany had produced so few of them that most divisions never saw one. The panzer divisions got priority. Elite units received the newest equipment. Everyone else made do with what remained. And what remained, increasingly, were horses and outdated trucks, struggling through impossible conditions. The contrast became visceral in the first days of the Ardennes offensive. American units, caught by surprise, fell back in disorder. But their artillery remained organized. M7 batteries displaced, set up defensive positions, and fired on German columns advancing down the roads. The self-propelled guns could reposition faster than German forces could adjust their attacks. They'd fire from one position, displace before counter-battery fire arrived, and be ready to shoot from a new location within minutes. German artillery, when it arrived, was devastating. The SFH-18 could throw a 44-kilogram shell over 13 kilometers. When German gunners had time to set up, when they had clear fields of fire, when they weren't under air attack, they were deadly effective. But those conditions became increasingly rare as the offensive bogged down. American fighter bombers appeared whenever the weather cleared. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs. They hunted German supply columns. They strafed artillery positions. Horse-drawn artillery made excellent targets. The horses couldn't hide. The guns couldn't move quickly. A single strafing run could kill the horses, immobilize the gun, and leave the crew scrambling for cover. The M7, by contrast, could button up. The crew could duck into the fighting compartment. The armor wasn't thick enough to stop anything larger than small arms fire, but it provided protection against shrapnel and machine gun bullets, and most importantly, the M7 could move. Fire. Move. Fire. Move. The doctrine called it shoot and scoot. German artillery doctrine had no equivalent concept because towed guns couldn't execute it. By December 21, 1944, the German offensive had stalled, not from lack of courage, not from poor tactics. The Volksgrenadier and Panzer divisions fought with desperate determination, but the logistics were collapsing. Fuel shortages strangled the advance. Artillery couldn't keep up with the armor. American reinforcements were arriving, faster than German forces could exploit their initial breakthroughs. At Bastogne, the story played out in miniature. The 101st Airborne Division, the 969th Artillery Battalion, and Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division held the town against overwhelming German forces. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day by December 22nd. But those rounds were delivered by M7 batteries that could reposition to avoid German counter-battery fire, that could support different sectors of the perimeter within minutes, that provided the mobile fire support that kept the defensive line intact. The Germans surrounded Bastogne. They had superior numbers. They had heavier tanks. But they didn't have the artillery mobility to concentrate overwhelming fire on a single point long enough to break through. Their guns were spread out, harder to coordinate, slower to displace. American artillery, including the M7S, could mass fires from multiple batteries on demand. The difference was doctrinal, but it was enabled by technology, the technology that Weber was looking at in that captured command post. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Other Wehrmacht officers had drawn similar conclusions. Reports filtered up through channels. The Americans possessed mobile artillery that could keep pace with their armor. The Americans could concentrate fires rapidly. The Americans could displace before German counter-battery fire became effective. These weren't revelations. German doctrine had called for exactly this kind of artillery mobility for decades, but calling for something, and actually fielding it, were different matters. The industrial capacity required to produce thousands of self-propelled guns exceeded what Germany could muster by late 1944. Every factory was under bombardment. Every resource was stretched beyond breaking. Steel that might have gone into more Westbys or Hummels went into Tiger tanks instead. Tanks that couldn't move without fuel. Tanks that broke down on the rutted roads of the Ardennes. Tanks that fought brilliantly when they had fuel and ammunition, but increasingly sat abandoned for lack of both. The Americans, meanwhile, kept their supply lines flowing. Red Ball Express truck convoys rolled forward. C-47 transport planes dropped supplies. Engineers rebuilt bridges and cleared roads. And M7 batteries, fully motorized, fully tracked, kept pace with the advancing armor, whether in attack or defense. Weber examined the gun mechanism. Standard U.S. 105mm howitzer. M2 A1 model. Barrel length of 22.5 calibers. The same gun used in towed versions by American infantry divisions. But mounted on this chassis, it became something more. The traverse mechanism allowed the gun to swing 45 degrees, not full 360-degree rotation like a tank turret, but enough for most fire missions without having to reposition the entire vehicle. The ammunition storage was ingenious: 69 rounds in individual protective cylinders, 7 on the left wall, 5 on the right, the rest in the hull beneath the fighting compartment. The crew could sustain fire missions without immediate resupply. Compare that to towed artillery, where ammunition had to be brought forward in separate vehicles, unloaded by hand, and stockpiled near the gun position. Every step took time. Every step created vulnerability. The crew positions told another story. Commander, driver, gunner. 4 ammunition handlers, 7 men total, all protected by the vehicle's armor during movement, all trained to fight as a unit. German towed artillery required more men. Gun crew, horse handlers or truck drivers, ammunition carriers, security troops. The personnel requirements multiplied when you factored in the entire support structure required to keep towed artillery mobile. Weber had read the American manuals captured in earlier operations. The level of detail was remarkable. Every procedure standardized, every crew member trained to perform specific tasks in specific sequences. Fire mission received, gun laid on target, charge selected, shell loaded, fire command given, shot away. The whole cycle could be completed in under a minute for experienced crews, and because everything was standardized, replacement crews could slot into the system without lengthy retraining. German artillery crews were equally professional, but they operated with more variation. Different units had different procedures, regional variations in training, equipment that wasn't always standardized. A gun crew transferred from one battery to another might find subtle differences in how things were done. Nothing catastrophic, but friction nonetheless. Small inefficiencies that accumulated across an entire army. The Americans had industrialized warfare, not just in production, but in execution. Every M7 battery operated the same way. Every fire mission followed the same procedures. Every crew spoke the same technical language. This wasn't the celebrated German flexibility. This was American mass production applied to military doctrine. Build enough of something, make it reliable enough, train enough people to use it, and overwhelm the enemy with sheer volume of effective firepower. And it worked. Weber had seen it work. In the first hours of the offensive, German forces had achieved surprise. American units retreated in confusion. But within hours, American artillery was responding. Within a day, American fire support was coordinated and effective. Within 2 days, German forces were running into concentrated artillery fire at every choke point, every road junction, every attempt to exploit the breakthrough. The M7 batteries had been part of that response. They'd displaced from their initial positions, established new firing, positions covering the approaches to key terrain, fired harassment missions on German supply routes, supported American counterattacks, and done it all while maintaining the mobility to avoid German artillery fire when it came. Towed German guns couldn't match that tempo. They'd unlimber. Fire. But if they needed to move, it took time. Limber up the gun, hitch it to the prime mover or horse team, move to the new position, unlimber again, set up the trails, check the level, lay the gun on target. By the time all that was accomplished, the tactical situation might have changed completely. Weber thought about his own batteries, somewhere back in the congested roads leading to the front. He hoped they'd make it forward in time to support the next phase of the offensive. If there was a next phase, if the fuel situation improved, if the weather stayed bad enough to keep American aircraft grounded, if American reinforcements didn't arrive faster than German forces could advance. Too many ifs. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace was already grinding to a halt, not from any single cause, but from accumulated friction. fuel shortages, traffic jams, stronger than expected American resistance, and artillery that couldn't keep pace with the advance. The captured M7 represented everything Germany had failed to achieve. Not a failure of engineering. German engineers were among the best in the world. Not a failure of doctrine. German tactical doctrine was sophisticated and well-reasoned, but a failure of industrial capacity, a failure to translate good ideas into mass production, a failure to prioritize the unglamorous but essential systems that made modern warfare possible. Germany had built Tigers and Panthers, magnificent tanks, technological marvels, but they'd built them in relatively small numbers, and they couldn't keep them supplied with fuel and ammunition. America had built Shermans, less impressive in single combat, but they'd built tens of thousands of them, and they kept them running, kept them supplied, kept them in the fight. The same pattern held for artillery. Germany had excellent towed howitzers and a small number of outstanding self-propelled guns. America had good towed howitzers and thousands of adequate self-propelled guns. Adequate multiplied by thousands overwhelmed excellent multiplied by dozens. It was mathematics. Cold, brutal mathematics. Weber's radio operator called from outside. Another message from division headquarters. The offensive was being adjusted. New objectives, shorter advances, more realistic goals. The kind of language that meant the original plan had failed. He took one last look at the M7. American soldiers would probably recapture it within days, maybe hours. The German advance had already lost momentum. American reinforcements were closing in from north and south. The weather was clearing, which meant American air superiority would return with devastating effect. But Weber had learned something. He'd learned what modern artillery should look like. He'd learned what industrial capacity could achieve when properly directed. He'd learned that Germany was fighting a war of attrition against enemies who could replace their losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The lesson was clear, even if the implications were uncomfortable. Germany had lost this war the moment it became a contest of industrial production. The brilliant early victories had depended on tactical superiority and operational surprise. But once the war settled into grinding attrition, once it became about replacing destroyed equipment faster than the enemy, once it became about logistics and supply chains and industrial output, Germany couldn't compete. American artillery doctrine had been designed around that reality. Build self-propelled guns that were good enough, build them in vast numbers, integrate them into every armored division, train crews to standard procedures, establish supply lines to keep them fed with ammunition and fuel, then turn them loose and watch them provide overwhelming fire support wherever needed. The M7 wasn't perfect. Its limited elevation reduced its maximum range. Its thin armor made it vulnerable. Its open top exposed the crew to artillery bursts overhead. But it was reliable. It was mobile. It was available in numbers that mattered. And that made it more valuable than the handful of Hummels scattered across the entire Wehrmacht. Weber climbed down from the M7. Outside, the snow continued to fall. His men were organizing the captured equipment, trying to salvage anything useful. Weapons, ammunition, rations, fuel, especially fuel. Every jerry can of American gasoline was precious. Every drop could keep a German tank moving for a few more kilometers. But they wouldn't take the M7. They couldn't. No trained crew to operate it. No ammunition compatible with German fire direction procedures. No way to integrate it into their existing support structure. The Americans designed their equipment for their own doctrine, their own logistics, their own way of fighting. You couldn't just bolt American equipment onto a German unit and expect it to work. That was another lesson. Weapon systems didn't exist in isolation. They were part of integrated systems: doctrine, training, logistics, maintenance, communications. All of it had to work together. The M7 was effective because it fit into the American system. Remove it from that system, and it was just an orphaned piece of hardware. The Germans had captured American equipment throughout the war: tanks, half-tracks, trucks, rifles. Sometimes they used it. Often during the Bulge, desperate for any advantage, they pressed captured vehicles into service. But it was never ideal. Ammunition didn't match. Parts weren't available. Crews weren't familiar with the controls. It was expedient, not optimal. The real value of captured equipment wasn't in using it. The real value was in studying it. Understanding what the enemy had built. Understanding why they'd built it that way. That intelligence informed future development, future doctrine, future procurement decisions. Not that future procurement mattered much anymore. By late 1944, Germany's ability to develop and field new weapons systems was severely constrained. Raw materials were scarce. Factory capacity was limited. Transportation infrastructure was degraded. The elaborate German system of weapons development and production that had created so many innovative designs was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and material shortages. Weber issued orders to his men: prepare to move forward. The attack was continuing. Even if the objectives had been scaled back, they'd advance as far as fuel and ammunition allowed. They'd fight with whatever they had, horse-drawn artillery and all. As he left the command post, he passed the M7 one final time. American recovery crews would probably have it back in action within a week. They'd tow it to a maintenance depot, replace any damaged components, reload it with ammunition, assign a new crew, and send it back to the front. That was American logistics in action: recover, repair, return to service. The industrial machine never stopped. The snow muffled the distant sounds of artillery, German guns, miles away, still firing in support of the offensive. American guns, closer than they should be, firing in defense of positions that should have fallen days ago. The battle continued, but the outcome was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Weber trudged through the snow back to his unit. They had orders to attack again at dawn. They'd do their duty. They'd fight with skill and courage. But skill and courage couldn't overcome the fundamental imbalances that the M7 represented. Industrial capacity, logistical depth, doctrinal integration. The Americans had all three. Germany had echoes of what they'd once possessed, growing fainter with every battle. In the history books, the Ardennes offensive would be remembered as Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate attempt to change the course of the war through operational audacity. It would be remembered for Bastogne and Malmedy, for heroic stands and atrocities, for ultimate failure. But for Weber, standing in that Belgian forest in December 1944, the M7 priest represented something more profound. It represented the victory of systems over genius, of industrial depth over tactical brilliance, of adequate equipment in overwhelming numbers over perfect equipment in insufficient quantities. The Germans had designed beautiful weapons. The SFH-18 was a masterpiece of artillery engineering. The Tiger tank was the most powerful armoured vehicle on any battlefield. The MG-42 machine gun set standards that influenced designs for decades. German engineering was world-class. But war isn't won by engineering excellence alone. War is won by the side that can field enough decent equipment, keep it supplied, keep it maintained, and keep it in action. The Americans had mastered that unglamorous reality. They'd built an industrial system that could produce mountains of equipment and a logistical system that could deliver it where needed. The M7 was the perfect symbol of that approach. Not the best self-propelled gun theoretically possible, but a good enough self-propelled gun produced in quantities that mattered, integrated into a doctrine that used it effectively. That combination proved unbeatable. By Christmas 1944, the German offensive had definitively stalled. Fuel shortages crippled the panzer divisions. American reinforcements sealed the penetration. Allied air power returned with clearing weather and devastated German supply columns. The Wehrmacht's last reserves were exhausted in a failed gamble. The M7 batteries that had supported the American, defense around Bastogne and Street Vith, and a dozen other critical points had played their role. Not glamorous. Not celebrated like the paratroopers who held Bastogne or the tank destroyers that stopped Kampfgruppe Peiper. But essential. Mobile fire support that arrived when needed, fired when called, and relocated before German counter-battery fire could suppress it. In the years after the war, military analysts would study the Ardennes offensive exhaustively. They'd analyze Hitler's strategic thinking, German tactical execution, American defensive resilience, the role of weather and terrain and logistics. But buried in the detailed analyses would be recognition of something fundamental. Modern mechanized warfare required mobile artillery. Towed guns, no matter how good, couldn't keep pace with armored operations. The Americans had understood that in 1941 they'd designed the M7 to solve that problem. They'd produced it in numbers sufficient to equip every armored division. They'd integrated it into their doctrine and trained their crews to use it effectively. By 1944, mobile artillery support was simply how American forces operated. Germany had understood the principle. Their doctrine called for mobile artillery, but understanding and implementation are different challenges. Germany built some self-propelled guns, but never enough. Never enough to replace towed artillery in more than a fraction of units. Never enough to change the fundamental reality that most German artillery moved on horses or outdated trucks. That gap between doctrine and capability defined Germany's position by late 1944. They knew what they needed. They couldn't produce it in sufficient quantities. And that inability, repeated across every category of equipment and every theatre of war, ensured their defeat. Weber never saw another M7 Priest after that December day in 1944. His unit retreated with the rest of the Wehrmacht as the Ardennes offensive collapsed. They fell back to the Siegfried Line, then into Germany itself. By May 1945, the war was over. The M7, meanwhile, continued serving. It fought through the final campaigns in Europe. It went to the Pacific theatre in smaller numbers. It served in the Korean War, where its mobility proved invaluable again in mountainous terrain. Modified versions remained in service with various armies into the 1980s. It was never the most powerful self-propelled gun, never the most heavily armoured, never the most technologically advanced, but it was reliable, mobile, and available in the numbers that mattered. In war, that combination beats perfection every time. The story of the M7 Priest and the Wehrmacht's realization about artillery mobility isn't about one dramatic battle or one technological breakthrough. It's about the unglamorous reality that modern war is won by logistics, industrial capacity, and sound doctrine properly executed. The Germans had brilliant tactics and excellent individual weapons. The Americans had adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers, supported by logistics that never failed. That cold December morning when Hauptmann Weber examined that captured M7, he saw the future of artillery. Mobile, integrated with armour, produced in industrial quantities. And he understood, perhaps more clearly than he wanted to, that Germany had lost the race to that future. The M7 rolled forward with American armies until victory was achieved. The horse-drawn German batteries struggled through retreat until they ran out of horses, then out of fuel, then out of ammunition, then out of war. That disparity, played out across 1,000 battlefields, decided the conflict. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.